really appreciate your testimony. This is all enormously helpful, and I'm very happy to get it on the record. So I'm going to start with a round of questions, and then I will go to the ranking member, Senator Kennedy. So the American economy depends on American workers. And when more Americans are working, our economy can produce more. When production's up, families can spend more. When Americans are spending, companies can hire more. There's no question that more workers means a better economy for families everywhere. Getting Americans to work is especially important today. Right now, thanks to President Biden, the state of our economy is strong. We have more businesses looking for workers than we have workers looking for jobs. But to keep our economy humming along and to stave off inflation, it's important we get more workers into the workforce to fill those open jobs. So, Dr. Edwards, let me just ask you, I want to make sure we get this on the record. You're an economist who studies labor markets. Does access to affordable, high-quality care affect labor market participation rates?
Yes, both the availability of care and its price are related to labor force participation. There's a very clear elasticity of the relationship between the increase in price and the decrease in maternal employment.
Okay, so these two things are very closely linked. In other words, childcare is basic infrastructure for our economy, just like roads and bridges that we drive on every day to get to work. Now, let's talk about what it looks like when basic infrastructure shuts down. Ms. Hardy, you are the co-founder and chief operating officer of Bobby, a company that produces infant formula. You're also, as you've described, a mother of 2 young children. Take me back to the early days of the pandemic. What happened to the child care that you and your employees relied on during those first few weeks?
It's hard to go back to that time.
Yeah, no one wants to.
But I'll do it.
Yes, but let's talk about it.
At the top of the pandemic, Bobby was literally just launching our business. We've been on the market for just shy of 3 years, right? So just to put that into perspective. And it impacted everything. I remember myself staring at a document. I was about to sign an office lease for our new business, and overnight, the whole world changed. All of our employees went home. We all logged onto Zoom, and right there, front and center, for the entire team to see, was working parents, trying to manage a kid, that little head running by in the background, and trying to focus at work. It was absolutely impossible for them to manage that tension. I myself had a teacher move into my home, and I ran a kindergarten for a whole year. Everybody at Bobby knows recess is at 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. at my house. But truly, this is not something that we can fix on our own as business owners. I pride myself on how we support parents, and I had a real moment of pause coming here today because childcare is the one nut that we cannot crack on our own. It is impossible for us to solve. So we need partnership. True partnership between business owners and the government to solve this collectively on behalf of working parents.
So that's a very powerful point, and I'm not going to drop this point. I just want to make sure I get everything else on the record here, but I very much hear you, and we're going to talk about this. But I do want to go back. I was saying about the first few months of the pandemic, you talk about how everything changed overnight. You know, Americans experienced job loss on a scale not seen since the Great Depression. Over 20 million Americans were suddenly out of work, and they couldn't pay their child care providers. Hundreds of thousands of child care providers were at risk of shutting their doors. Mr. Hopkins is nodding about this because you remember these days. So this is when Senator Tina Smith and I led the charge to secure $50 billion with a B in emergency stabilization funding to help child care providers stay solvent, to try to keep workers on the payroll, and to handle the unexpected expenses that cropped up in trying to deal with the presence of this virus. So, Mr. Hopkins, I want to get your view here. You run a child care center in Virginia. How did the Pandemic Stabilization Fund affect your operation?
Senator Rowan, let me start by letting you know that Hopkins House is an 84-year-old institution. We serve the range of Americans who need childcare, from military to working to government folks. And the 1.2 million we received in federal funding represented 8% of our budget over the pandemic, but it was absolutely life-saving for the institution. Had it not been for this funding, we might have been among the 67% of child care providers in Virginia that had to close temporarily and permanently. These funds also enabled us to save 60 jobs in the child care industry that served the military folks from Fort Belvoir and the Pentagon, where some of our folks' children come from. It also allowed us to continue serving essential workers. We only closed for 3 weeks during the pandemic. And it was because of the funding from the federal government, we were able, as an institution, to continue helping the folks in this country who needed that help.
So this picks up on the theme that you had laid down, Ms. Hardy, and that is the importance of partnership between the federal government and, in this case, the providers of child care. And what I'm hearing you say is that the emergency stabilization funding was critical to keeping child care afloat during the pandemic. Dr. Edwards, though, I want to go back to labor market on this. Who suffered the steeper job losses during the pandemic, men or women?
Men lost about 13% of jobs, or that is to say 13% of men lost jobs and about 17% of women.
Okay, so more women, or as a percentage of workers in the workforce, lost their jobs than men, although it was both.
It was actually absolute and relative terms, more women in number, and a larger share of women lost their jobs in the first 2 months of the pandemic.
And 3 years later, have women workers overall recovered from the pandemic?
Yes, aggregate labor force participation and employment of women has recovered from their pandemic losses.
So did preserving the child care sector help ensure that workers, parents, particularly women, could get back to work as the pandemic waned?
You know, absolutely. In fact, the 3 million increase in labor force participation over the past year has been led by prime-age women who are 25 to 54, and women with children under 5 are currently experiencing some of the highest labor force participation rates they've ever seen, far above their past peak.
All right. So access to quality child care and a strong economy go hand in hand. If child care centers had closed their doors in March 2020 and never reopened, a very real possibility at that point, our economy would have suffered serious long-term consequences. But because child care centers were able to stay open, parents were able to continue to work and rejoin the workforce when the economy opened back up. In fact, under President Biden, the U.S. economy has already added over 13 million jobs, and the unemployment rate has now hit a 50-year low. The emergency funding that we fought for helped save jobs, it helped save child care providers, and it helped save American families. And in a few minutes, I want to talk more about the details of this, but now I want to turn to my partner here, Ranking